If you think it's time to take a hammer to your bathroom scale and rip up the diet rulebook, well, welcome to Body Kindness. Hi, everyone. It's Rebecca Scritchfield, author of Body Kindness and host for this podcast. I'm a health at every size dietitian, a certified exercise physiologist, a former chronic dieter, and mom to 2 girls. Join me as I talk to guests about what it means to be good to ourselves and create a better life where well-being matters, not weight. Through these conversations, we'll reveal the challenging and surprising ways our culture keeps us searching for our worth and our appearance. So let's create a new view of health that's inclusive and built on compassion and respect for all bodies. Let's shake things up and let's change the game. Hey listeners, would you like to help advance research on body image healing? I'm co-investigator of a new study with Dr. Jennifer Webb, director of the Integrative Positive Psychology Research Lab in Mindfulness, Body Acceptance, Culture, and Health at UNC Charlotte. And we're looking for body kindness readers living in the U.S. to participate in a survey. If you're a woman who's currently pregnant or with at least 1 child under 5, and you are reading or have recently read Body Kindness, we would love to hear from you. Visit bodykindnessbook.com/research to learn more. Those who complete the survey will be eligible to receive access to an exclusive web-based body kindness training with downloadable resources for pregnant and postpartum women developed by me. Please help us spread the word about the research study by sharing the link on social media. That's bodykindnessbook.com/research. And if you haven't yet read Body Kindness, there are a limited number of free ebook copies available. Visit bodykindnessbook.com/research. If you have any questions, please email me, Rebecca@bodykindnessbook.com.
You know, because I'd been taught, like many fat people, like probably most fat people, that I could change behavior. I could change the cruel behavior around me simply by being more disciplined. All I had to do was eat less food and move more, and magically the bigots around me would stop acting like bigots. And I say, right, like, whether like weight gain or weight gain, weight loss, like weight loss specifically, it takes a really long time, often doesn't, ultimately stick or anything like that. But bigotry you can get rid of, right? Like fatness takes a long time to change. Bigotry you can change instantly. You can stop being a bigot right now. Instant results guaranteed. And I often remind people that, right? I'm just like, girl, think about who actually has the smaller task, right? You fundamentally changing your body or someone not being an.
That was Virgie Tovar. Virgie is an author, activist, and one of the nation's leading experts and lecturers on fat discrimination and body image. She's the founder of Babecamp, a 4-week online course designed to help women who are ready to break up with diet culture. And she started the hashtag campaign, Lose Hate, Not Weight. It's one of my favorites. If you follow that on Instagram, you'll find lots of wonderful people to follow and share their stuff and comment on their work. It's really healing and supportive. So I'm a big fan of Lose Hate, Not Weight. Virgie has been featured by the New York Times, Tech Insider, Al Jazeera, and NPR. She pens a weekly column called Take the Cake on ravishly.com. I am a regular reader of her posts with Ravishly. They're excellent pieces of work, especially when it comes to fat activism and liberation of bodies and body image healing. I think you'll really love reading her stuff if you're not already a regular reader. Now, as far as books are concerned, Virgie edited the groundbreaking anthology Hot and Heavy, Fierce Fat Girls on Life, Love, and Fashion. That was with Seal Press in November 2012. I highly recommend that book. And her latest nonfiction work is called You Have the Right to Remain Fat. And that's published in August 2018 by Feminist Press. And it's this work that is the topic of our conversation on the podcast today. So you're going to hear lots of interesting things about the book, how she came to write it, topics that she tackles in the book. So we cover a lot of ground, and I really think you're going to get something helpful out of this book, including one of the things I most valued about the conversation was talking a little bit about how it's great that we have a body positivity movement going mainstream, but some of Virgie's concerns with it being watered down and just some things that we need to make sure we do to help keep it intersectional. So you will hear in this conversation, Virgie, talk about topics like racism and rape culture and how these things intersect with the diet culture. And if you don't already have the book, I think by after our conversation, you're going to run right out and get it and add it to your library of pieces of work that really help you find peace and freedom with your own body and help you evolve in your own practice of body kindness, as well as that energy that you need to help change our culture for the better. Enjoy the show. Hey, Virgie, welcome to Body Kindness.
Hi, thank you.
I'm so excited to have you on the show today. I have to tell you that, so when I was very, very, very new to Health at Every Size, like day one, your name, Virgie Tovar, you were already a dominant name around. Anyone I encountered said, read her stuff, sharing me your articles, and I would absorb them. And it was kind of like my studies. So you have a long career and significant background as a fat activist and creating cultural change. I would just love for those who might not know, all the details or just how you would recount for who you are and what you do and why.
Yeah, I mean, so I want to kind of even just out the gate, just contextualize, right? I am, in terms of body size, right? I'm a 250-pound woman, right? And so I grew up in a fat family. I was always a fat kid. I was a fat baby. And I was introduced to Fatphobia at around the age of 5, which is pretty typical for someone raised in the US. And sort of I became highly aware of my body as wrong and myself as a bad person because I was fat, which is kind of like the dominant paradigm. Like ugliness, like references to beauty, ugliness, and references to morality are very common in the way we talk about fatness. They're very connected. And especially if you're a woman, right? Like beauty is considered this outward expression of like inner purity and like morality. Anyway, so I grew up with all that. And I went on to do what a lot of fat people do, which is starve myself. I mean, I quote unquote dieted, and I use like the word dieting a lot in my work, but more and more I'm like, there is no difference between an eating disorder and a diet. There isn't, right? I'm like, they're definitely on a spectrum, right? Like certainly there are people who have very acute eating disorders, where they literally, their life is completely and utterly committed to this and they can't do things that are meaningful to them. But I would argue that dieters are on the same spectrum. They're not on a different planet, right? They're on the same planet. So anyway, but like I was deep in my eating disordered reality and starving myself and exercising. And I was trying to like eradicate myself from my own life in a lot of ways. And I didn't want to do anything that mattered to me really until I was thin. In my mind, that was always like on the horizon. Eventually I'm going to be thin and eventually I can go to the beach and work with people and go on dates. Eventually I can take pictures of myself. Eventually I can wear canary yellow. All the things that I really wanted. And, I kind of found that no matter what I did, I wasn't ever getting the result. And on top of that, right, anytime I would reach a quote weight goal, the goalpost moved. It would get lower and lower and lower. And this is very common because that's the way that diet culture mindset works. Anyway, through kind of a series of very fortuitous events, I ended up finding fat activism. And that really happened when I was in graduate school. I was interested in studying fat women and I wanted to understand, and also specifically women of color. I was really interested in how fatness had sort of affected gender identity specifically. And I mostly worked with, as I said, women of color. So through this research, I'm reading books and I'm sort of going down the rabbit hole that is fat studies or fat activism, which was very new to me. Fat studies itself was very new at the time. And this was, just to contextualize, this was 2010, 2011. And so through a chance meeting, right? And just so you know, like fat activism, that movement was so small and so insular that everyone who was identifying as a fat activist knew each other all over the planet. So And it was, again, through happenstance that someone, I don't know how this person found out that I was doing research in this area. And then it spread through the grapevine.
Mm-hmm.
It was just, I mean, I think that's what's so fascinating and incredible about a political movement as it's sort of in its infancy, right? Like we all have a shared goal. The goal is liberation. The goal is more justice. The goal is for for people who are subjugated to have a better life. And so there's no desire to hide resources from one another in a political movement, because the more people there are, the better it is. And so, right, it doesn't have that kind of, and I think this is important. It might come up later because I
Mm-hmm.
think that the sort of the work that I'm doing now, it feels like the movement has kind of moved away from that sentiment in a lot of ways. But anyway, so I was introduced to everybody in the world who was doing this, right? Like they were like, "Oh, do you know this person in Australia? Do you know this person in the UK? Do you know this person in, I live in San Francisco. Do you know this person in Portland? Do you know this person in New York?" Right? And so immediately I was brought into the fold and invited to this fat conference, which was happening annually at the time in Oakland. And I met a bunch of fat activists who really changed my life completely.
Mm.
And kind of the moment that really I talk about that transition happening was that I walk into the hotel where the conference is happening. There is a swimming pool and I can smell it before I even see it. And I can hear laughter and and it's just right. It's this incredible, very physical, like body memory that I have. And as I'm walking in, I see this bunch of like fat babes wearing amazing bathing suits and huge sunglasses, and they're laughing and they're putting on sunscreen and they're chatting with each other and they're playing in the pool, and there's no discernible trace of shame in their existence whatsoever. And I just had never seen anything like it. And that was sort of like my moment of conversion, because this was the life that I'd always wanted, and thought that I had to get thin to have. And I think once I realized, that I could have this life on my own terms, this fabulous, amazing, unapologetic life on my own terms, and through the research in grad school, finding out about the truly disgusting, horrific, unforgivable history of diet culture and what it does to women's lives, those two in combination, really created an opportunity for me and like really a call to action for me to become an activist around this issue. And so what I really sort of see my role in the movement is doing is, lending language, giving language to a lot of the things that are just feelings inside of our body. Like we know something's not right. Like we might feel something is wrong in the way that I felt like something was wrong when I was dieting for all those years. And the something that was wrong was the culture, not me. I had been taught that it was me. And so, right. But like what I do is I lend language to that feeling. And so grad school gave me that language. I have a very, I almost broke my brain in graduate school trying to understand theory and cultural criticism and understanding, like what happens when we don't just look at individual behaviors in isolation, when we collect them and we say, what can we say about the history or the sociology or the anthropology about these behaviors in aggregate? And that's sort of what I do. I look at the culture on a grand scale and say, this is what I see, this is what I see, this is what I see. And I write about those things. And I use my academic background to try and make those and to try and like make that reality more clear for people so that they can articulate when something wrong is happening, when something unfair is happening, and what justice looks like in the era where language is not always clear, is not always obvious around like what the intent of the language or the behavior might be.
Yeah. And it is so important to be able to do that for people, because otherwise they are just kind of walking around assuming that what the culture is defining for them is what they should be doing. And so, it's I think of it as like eye-opening and awareness building so that people can know more and do better. But I think that you do it in a way that also is kind of that call to attention so that we don't ignore it anymore, right? So it's not, it makes you think about things a little bit harder, look inward and look outward. And I have a lot of questions I want to ask you about all those things that you've talked about earlier. But I'm going to start with your latest book. You have The Right to Remain Fat. I'm holding up my hand right now. And this is basically, it's your manifesto, this book, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
My first question for you is, where did you get that awesome title?
Oh my gosh, it's such a funny story. So we didn't know what the title. Oh, I remember. Okay. So there was an original title. I wanted to call, are you ready for this? I wanted to call it American Femicide. And my editor was like, okay, that's a great title. That's not the title of this book. And I was like, okay. And I wasn't sure if she was gently trying to tell me, like, you're not ready to write a book with that title. Cause I think it's right. Like, I think there is something to be said about career development and like developing our craft and whatnot. So I'm like, maybe like in 10 years down the road, you'll see American Femicide. I don't know. But anyway, she was like, or maybe she was trying to say the other alternative was the energy of the book doesn't match that title. I think because I am kind of in the book, like I'm funny, I'm silly, I'm personal. And so one of the chapters, the last chapter in the book that I submitted with that former title as my expected title was called You Have the Right to Remain Fat. And it was just kind of like, I don't know. I mean, I'm somebody who loves language and playing with language, and I love puns, and I love, I'm such a punny person. I love re-envisioning. I love rhymes, right? So it made total sense for me. And I'm also kind of a feminist troll. And so the idea of kind of like taking this phrase that is so prevalent in mass media, and also that is specifically like in this really punitive environment that it's happening, and to kind of re-envision it and to reclaim it. And in that way to kind of play with the idea of this like punitive culture and this police moment where you're getting arrested, right? To like then just like transform it into this like fun, kind of campy, unexpected, like LOL, she did it, right? Like kind of a thing. So I think like it brings together like my playful and yet very political and very punny nature, like all together.
I mean, I'm telling you, the second I heard it, I was like, perfection. And it did. It evoked emotion. Like I got it. I understood right away. I saw the cop. I saw the patriarchy. I saw the handcuffs. I saw it all. And I was like, this is why I love her. She's so freaking brilliant. So way to go. Kudos all the way.
Thank you.
But it's much, much more than the title. Like I was saying earlier, it is your manifesto. So my question to you to start off the conversation about the content is like, why this book and why now?
Yeah. So there's a few answers to that question. First of all, if you're a lady writer, you have a lot of pressure to write memoir. And memoir is fantastic, but I just want to be clear about the reality of publishing. Like even when women writers don't want to write memoir, we are pushed to write memoir because that is what sells, right? And I think there's a number of reasons why, but like I want to specifically say, right, like women don't get to do cultural criticism. Men get to do cultural criticism, right? And so because the idea is men get to speak for all of us, especially for like a white straight man, right? You get to speak for all humanity.
Yes.
Women simply don't. And so, right, what I'm doing with this book is I'm speaking about cultural realities on a grand scale, global realities on a grand scale. And that is really taboo as a woman writer to do. So like, I mean, I want to indicate, there's a context in publishing and the culture and what the culture allegedly wants to see according to publishing and what the culture maybe perhaps does want to see. Those things are important to contextualize this work. So I want to say like, it's very powerful that Feminist Press, really stood by me and encouraged me to write a work of theory. So I just want to say that right there. I think, right now, and there are things in the book, right? Like so I was writing this book before the election, before we knew the outcome of the election. And so it's interesting kind of seeing even in this very brief period, I wrote the book in 2017, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's incredible seeing the transition so quickly. Just seeing, like, there are moments where I write in the book, like, yeah, it's really difficult to understand that sexism is a reality because we have, as a culture, created a very obscure language around talking around about gender that allows us to believe that we're no longer living in sexism. And then Trump comes along and shows exactly. I'm like, yeah, there it is.
Grabs
right?
him by the pussy.
Yes, totally. And I was like, oh, right, yes, he's the evidence of my claim, right? In some ways, but also we're in a different era now because of him, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, right, like all of that work that had been done culturally to show us that we were done with sexism. Feminism doesn't need to exist anymore because ladies are equal. Like, and like, or like, we're post-racist. Don't have to worry about that anymore. No more organizing needed. We're done with that issue, right? And so our culture before Trump had really, really, really been pushing that line. And it wasn't real, right? The reality was that there was still a lot of sexism, racism, homophobia, etc. But it had kind of submerged in many ways into kind of a linguistic underground where we had learned how to talk about it respectably, quote unquote, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the difference between those two things, right, is like, somebody saying something like in 1903, like, oh, women cannot drive because their uterus takes so much blood from their brain, they're a hazard, to, this more subtle thing where we're like, there's a wage gap, but we're blaming women for not negotiating hard enough for their wages, 100 years later. And so I just kind of, those are, right, like these are symptoms of the same idea, but like one was very overt and one kind of isn't, right? One is more difficult to argue against and to see as a problem. Anyway, so I had a lot of urgency around writing this book. And in the book, I say I'm specifically writing to women directly.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we are at a critical juncture as the body positivity movement has kind of eclipsed fat liberation
Mm-hmm.
and has become a sort of a household name, right? It's important for people to remember that they have the right to really demand more than positivity, more than acceptance. And for me, this book is really about talking about this movement from a justice and a cultural perspective rather than an individual perspective. Like body love, self-love, those things are very, very important.
Mm-hmm.
However, there is more. We have the right to ask for more. And so I see the book as a little bit of my own offer of my tools and like my intellectual labor to help women make sense of and decode a lot of the things that the culture has hidden from us for a long time. And I make those connections by, talking about the connections between diet culture and rape culture, talking about what sexism actually looks like today, like in a moment where women have a lot of legal freedoms, but are still quite intellectually and physically bound to sexism through things like diet culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sexism that they don't necessarily see, which I like how you start the book, and I literally could connect with that 5-year-old version of you right away, the way you describe yourself. And, you describe like the innocence and the ability, like you're saying like my body was once mine, right? Like I could enjoy it jiggling and, it was part of something positive and good. And then it's like ... Culture took it away. And you talk about the one toxic idea, which is a message that your body is wrong. But here's what I love about that whole part in there is that you call it a series of violent events and then go on to say, and women call it normal life. So I thought that was so powerful. I was wondering if you could discuss that and like unpack that for the listeners.
Yeah. So, the opening of the book is this image of me as a 5-year-old. And my favorite part of the day was when we got home and I got to jiggle. I would take all my clothes off and I would spread out my arms and legs and I would jiggle like nonstop. And it was right. What was incredible about it was I can still remember the chemical reaction that the jiggling gave me, that that sort of downpour of pleasure and serotonin, it has chemically bonded into me. Like I can remember the pleasure feeling. And I just thought it was miraculous that my body could move and jiggle the way, like move and undulate the way that water did.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember how fun it was to feel my body, my fat little body, move in these really unique, special ways. And then, yeah, as sort of in our culture, we go through a series of educational events that are often sometimes nice, but often very violent and very scary and very dark. And that is the culture's way of assimilating us into it. So we're introduced to the carrot and the stick when we're kind of introduced to formal education.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of, it's interesting, right? Because what's happening is the education is coming sort of down the pipeline. There's a little bit of sort of like a trickle down effect. It's sort of coming down the pipeline. And what ends up happening is we're experiencing it laterally among peers. So we're getting the education from, often people who we as a culture call bullies. But what I think is interesting about a bully is always, always victimizing the people the culture itself victimizes. Bullies don't go after, like white straight men.
Oh,
There's
yeah.
a reason,
Yeah.
right? They go
They
after
are the
disabled
bullies.
people. They go
Mhm.
after queer people. They go after fat people, and they go after women. And they become the human embodiment of ideas that are very old and that live in our culture's history and that we're very ashamed of and that we don't like to talk about because it essentially they're the wheels that make the function, that make the culture function. So, right, the education, yes, is technically coming from your peers, but it's important to remember that those peers who are teaching you these things are emboldened through cultural ideas that stigmatize certain people and not others. So I was experiencing this education at the hands of boys who were my age. And there's a moment in the book where I talk about the first time a boy ever called me fat, a person ever called me fat. It was a boy, not surprisingly. And it was the boy in my class who used to look up all the girls' skirts. And I talk about, being a very small child and yet somehow knowing that there was a connection between the reason that the boy who looked up skirts was the boy who called me fat. And I mean, I couldn't understand at the time. I didn't have the intellectual capacity to understand at the time how I understood the implicit connection. But I remember knowing and understanding that there was a connection. And sort of like as we age, right, we experience more and more and more of these moments, right? People telling you that unless you look a certain way, you will be unlovable. Unless you look a certain way, you will not get a job, or you will not have the things you want, or you will not have a family. And these are things that humans want and need. Humans want love, visibility, success, belonging, right? We want like some sense of love and belonging at the end of the day. And what diet culture and any number of other culturally introduced ideas does is they position themselves as a broker between what humans need in order to survive, and themselves. And they say, if you do this, if you just keep giving, if you give, you will get this thing. And that idea that it's normal to have to earn love, that is that violent cultural education. The truth is, right, every single human deserves love unconditionally because every human needs love. Like babies will die without love, like literally just die. And humans, as we age, right, we don't physically die without love, but we spiritually die without it. And the culture creates a sort of a reality in which it's normalized that some people don't get access to it. And why is it normalized? Because those people serve as the lesson that keeps everybody else in line. And these are just, and I know it sounds really sinister and insane as I'm telling you this, but right, like if you look at the history of how certainly the West has structured itself, these things are in plain sight. You can read these in texts. You can read about these ideas in text during the formation of our nation. So like you really think about the metaphor of the birth of a nation, you think about like what the childhood of the United States, what was in those texts, what was in the ideas that built the country we see now, not that long ago. And you can find, if you know how to look for it, you can find evidence of those ideas everywhere. So I'm gonna leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. That is a lot. I mean, I'm nodding my head yes, and it is. I think it's a lot for listeners to take in. But the most powerful connection you made for me in just hearing you talk about that was a deeper understanding of why you had the original title you wanted for the book, because I did put that in my notes as I was reading. It was like, but how you make that in the book, you say it's assisted femicide masked as diet culture. And like, girl, the second you said that, it's like the hair on the back of my head or back of my neck rather stood up. And I was like, did she just say that? I was like,
Yeah.
and it was like a whoa moment for me. I mean, it's like you gave words to something that I didn't see it as that before. Like, I mean, of course I'm at a point where I know that diet culture is bad and unhelpful and we need to reject it right away. But that this idea, what you're saying to me is that we set it up so that in order to get to live, we are going to deny you these things that you need to live unless you conform. And that's what makes it femicide.
Yes, absolutely.
Damn.
And it might, good. I mean, right. Thank you. Yeah. And I think like with the femicide piece, there's two components. There's a literal component of femicide where it's like women are actually dying to be thin. They are dying, right? Like literally women are dying, like, doing either, right? Like they're dying through like eating, like acute eating disorders, or any number of things. And then there's kind of there's a metaphorical component to femicide, and that's the spiritual side of femicide, which is like, yes, you are technically alive, but like, what kind of life is it that you're putting your life on hold every day? You hate yourself. Like, I mean, I've worked with thousands of women, and I mean, the stories are like, don't tell me that diet culture isn't stealing women's lives away. I'm thinking of a woman right now who I worked with who she gave birth to her son, which was a really important moment in her life. And she couldn't even be present emotionally for it because all she could think about was how fat she looked while she was giving birth. And I'm like, if like diet culture isn't stealing women's lives, I mean, it's just not true, right? Like, I'm like, so I think there's a metaphorical component to the femicide piece as well, like spiritually subjugating people and saying that they won't get love unless they are thin. That is like that's an emotional murder. That's a spiritual murder. That's unconscionable. That's unthinkable. And we do it every day.
Yeah. Yeah. And in my experience in counseling in an outpatient setting, I could certainly tell you that across the spectrum, there is this commitment that is required in time and in money. And by the time they end up in my office, it's like that is another way of killing women slowly, right? Because of what they're not able to do because they are so hypervigilant about weight, shape, appearance, and all the things that they can't access. And for those who have thin privilege, right, might like have ways where they're not able to access, but still can access more. And then there's those who are higher weight who actually can't even access some of the privileges. So it's like they have another reason because their true lived experience is I have lack of access to social power here.
Yes, exactly.
Wow, this is all great stuff. So I wanted to talk about something in the book where you basically say, for a long time, I didn't know that other people's hatred wasn't my fault. And so I was wondering if you can explain that a little bit more in the context of fatphobia and specifically how it really does harm all people, because I think a lot of people miss that point.
Yeah, I mean, fatphobia, I define it in the book as a bigotry-based ideology that positions fat people as naturally inferior and positions weight loss as positive at any cost. And so, yeah, I mean, fat phobia is essentially, it's sort of, yes, it's a form of discrimination, a form of bigotry. People don't realize fat phobia is bigotry, right? Because we've been taught that fat phobia is about health, and therefore fat phobia is positive. And so with that framework, I was introduced to that framework as a child, as I mentioned. With that framework in mind, it positions cruel behavior as helpful to fat people, and people who are practicing fat phobia and being mean to fat people, either, overtly or through kind of this helping, concern trolling rhetoric, it emboldens them. I feel like fat phobia deputizes people to be mean to fat people and to be cruel and to sort of exclude fat people and to socially isolate fat people. And, because I'd been taught, like many fat people, like probably most fat people, that I could change behavior. I could change the cruel behavior around me simply by being more disciplined. All I had to do was eat less food and move more, and magically the bigots around me would stop acting like bigots. And I say, right, like, whether like weight gain, weight loss, like weight loss specifically, it takes a really long time, often doesn't, ultimately stick or anything like that. But bigotry you can get rid of, right? Like fatness takes a long time to change. Bigotry you can change instantly. You can stop being a bigot right now. Instant results guaranteed. And I often remind people that, right? I'm just like, girl, think about who actually has the smaller task, right? You fundamentally changing your body, or someone not being an asshole. And so I'm like, just stop being an asshole. Just like demand and expect people not to be assholes. But all that to be said, right? Like I had accepted this self-blaming narrative, this victim blaming narrative, where I could stop the pain whenever I wanted. I just had to be a good girl. And so I took that to task. I really believed that the people around me who were in fact being cruel were good people across the board. They were just being mean to me because I needed to be mean to, because I was bad. And my fatness was evidence of that badness. And so I had this idea of the people who were, engaging in cruelty as people who could become my friends and my lovers in the future when I was good and I deserved their affection. So with that framework in mind, like essentially that's what I'm saying in that chapter, which is I accepted the blame for being fat. I thought fatness really was a sign that I was undisciplined, bad, and ugly. And of course, no one wants to be considered those things. Right. And so I worked really, really hard to not be those things. And I don't know, like, I think it's really unfortunate that so many people really believe that other people's cruelty is their fault. And I lived in that reality for a really long time.
Yeah. And you write so well about it in the book and in your articles and everything like that, that really has a way of teaching people. And something that, maybe I'm hoping you could help clarify for me as we unpack this conversation around fat phobia is like an aggression versus a microaggression, right? Because I can imagine someone say, oh, well, I would never, I was watching Dietland the other day and my husband jumped in 5 episodes in, right? And he's like, I just can't believe the guys are being that mean to her on all these dates. I would never walk away in the middle of dinner. And I was like, oh yeah, right. You'd like, say something after, and so it's like this, like this idea of, you can tell some people would say, well, I would never like toward this real aggression, but they don't understand what a microaggression is and how it can be just as harmful and how it's still bigotry and still fat phobia. So I think you're the perfect person to help explain this.
Yeah, I mean, yes, essentially, right, we as a culture only see bigotry as overt, obvious, undeniable acts of cruelty. But the truth is, bigotry is more nuanced and more sophisticated than that. And it manifests in what, people call microaggressions. Like, I mean, I want to kind of, I wish that I could remember the name of the person who wrote the first article about microaggressions, but I can't remember. But it really did come up around race and racism, and that's where the conversation really began. And I think that's it's important to name that context because, as I mentioned earlier, we as a culture, still kind of believe that we're post racism, and yet the lived reality of a lot of people of color is that that's not true at all. So, right, like microaggressions kind of are these like smaller gestures that are subtle and potentially deniable, and show up often, sometimes, in the form of alleged helpfulness or alleged caring. Perfect example is when someone comes up to a fat person and says, "I'm just worried about your health." I mean, I'll give you a personal example that just happened to me last week. I was drinking coffee in the lovely coastal beach town of Santa Cruz, California. And, I was enjoying my morning, and this woman came up to me and she said, "I just want to let you know that you probably shouldn't eat pork." And she sort of she was going to kind of continue. And, and I said, "Don't talk to me while I'm drinking coffee." And, and then she proceeded. She was like, "I was just trying to do you a favor or try to help me." And I was like, "You're not helping me." And I ended, and it was like, I could tell from the energy that this woman had, and like just looking at her face and reading her body, that she truly thought that she was going to go home and pat herself on the back for doing a good deed today. That was her interrupting a fat person drinking coffee in the morning, looking adorable and telling her not to eat pork, was her idea of her doing her good deed for the day. Right. And it's right. And I think this is like a really fantastic example of sort of something that's in that more subtle range, where it's like, no, she didn't come up to me and say, "Ew, you're so disgusting and ugly," or "Ew, you're fat and you should die." Like, no, nothing like that. But it was kind of, it had the same effect of alienating, otherizing, and dehumanizing me. Right. And so I think that's not really an example of a microaggression. That's kind of an example of something that's a little bit more, in that it's still bigotry, even if it feels nice and sweet or helpful, because at the end of the day, she has internalized this idea there's something wrong with my body, and she's acting on it not from an aggressive, an overtly aggressive place, but from a place that seeks to still eradicate my existence, right? Like, the purpose of her comment is still for me to conform. It's still for me to be good. It's still for me to look exactly the way the culture tells me I'm supposed to look. That's still the intent of her comment. Right. And so that's the important thing, is to remember, right, that at the core of bigotry is elimination. It's elimination. And when we are acting from that place, whether it's overtly aggressive or not, if the core intent is conform, be good, sort of shave off your edges, don't stand out, whether that's sweet or mean, doesn't matter. That's the kind of intent. But I want to finish with microaggressions. Microaggressions are like, in my opinion, sort of the most subtle and the most difficult to kind of interrogate within ourselves. And they're often like physical gestures, like facial expressions. They might also be like comments that feel entirely out of left field. So for example, like when someone says, "Where are you from? Where's that accent from?" Right? It kind of creates a sense that someone noticed that you're different, and they have to position you in a box that makes you understandable to them. And right, so that's kind of like a more of like a in like race or kind of like a nationality example. Maybe in the fat sphere, I don't know, it might be the kind of thing where like someone doesn't want you to sit next to them on the bus and they don't move, or someone, refuses to go on a date with you because you're fat, or they flirt with you with no intention of ever asking you out because they know they can get away with it. Those are kind of like microaggressions.
Yeah. And that's, I think that was a wonderful explanation. I think that's like the key take home message there, is to know that it's obviously great to notice, when you see, obvious bigotry and aggression and can speak out against that, but really doing self-examination on ways where you may be experiencing microaggressions or you may be a contributor to them and, contributing to fat phobia and weight bias, in ways like, I know you started talking about how body positivity has taken over fat activism, but, you could be thinking you're body positive and you're doing your workout and a fat woman is next to you doing a workout and you've never talked to them before and you offer some sort of congratulatory support and encouragement to keep going, And it's just like, well, what are the assumptions that you're making that you're saying with that, like, would you do that to any stranger thin person, or was it because you noticed their higher weight and noticed that they must be performing the good fatty role, or just, oh, see, that's good, they do care about their health, and that is also part of the systemic problem. We're not all going to get out of this, I'm going to use your word again, assisted femicide. We're not going to get out of that without examining the own ways in which we contribute to fat phobia and microaggressions in our own lives.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that's so interesting to me, specifically about microaggressions, is that they're really about these ideologies that we haven't interrogated, right? Like, we might know how to behave, and we might even be working really, really hard towards, being more just and more moral and more good and more humanitarian. But there's kind of these residual things that sort of stay inside of us that are consistently confirmed by mass media and the culture all of the time. And so I think of microaggressions as, in some ways, right, they're the uninterrogated bits that are, inside of us and they're often showing up in people who otherwise are, trying very hard to be good people, but who are very affected by cultural messaging. And so I just kind of wanted to get into that. Like, often, right, often a lot of us have the behavior part down pat, right? We know what not to do and what to do and what not, right? We've been sort of really educated in that. And this arena is sort of like there's like these tiny bits of evidence that this ideology is still really living vibrantly in us, and we're still co-signing on it on some level. And like, how do we kind of settle into that more nuanced, like, okay, I know what not to say and what to say, but like, how do I get into really healing around fat phobia, healing around my residual ideas that these ideas are real and that they matter, and I think that the other part I'm going to say, I think this returns to your previous question in some ways. This is right, like, whatever ideas that we're outputting or having inside of us, right, that are bigotry based, they're affecting us, they're eroding us spiritually. There's a great cost to believing that conformity is important. There's a great cost to believing that some humans deserve bad outcomes. There's a great cost to believing even that we are superior to other people. Like, there is an extraordinary human cost attached to that. And that's the way that fat phobia and on various other kinds of stigma really impact all of us.
Yeah, there you go, making me think another layer deeper than I was prepared to think about. I mean, but I totally get what you're saying. You're absolutely right. That it's there's always something else that upholds that next thing that we're struggling with. But I do appreciate your encouragement about self-examination. And I think it is going to take a bit of self-compassion in a sense too, but it's okay. You are a human and you're making mistakes. Learn and grow, do better, challenge yourself, try to be part of freedom and resolution. Real briefly, because we know folks are going to buy the book and read themselves, but I just want to bring up a couple points that you talk about. I love how you associated dieting as a practice of fat phobia. That was very interesting to me. And I love that you acknowledge the context of which I see happening all the time, like diets in disguise, right? Oh, this isn't a diet. This is a lifestyle for energy management or whatever.
Yes, right.
Anything about weight, if it's about a body change or a weight and like do this and then you receive, this is what's called dieting and you're engaging in it because truth be told, you have fat phobia. You are afraid that something you either need to get rid of something that you have in body fat, or you're afraid if you don't do that, you will add the body fat, basically.
Yes, exactly.
And then you
Yeah.
talked about it being unavoidable, like diet culture being unavoidable. And I thought that was fascinating too. I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what takes dieting from an individual behavior um, to a culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
The fact that, like, I mean, I often ask people when I'm lecturing, can you imagine going a single day without hearing about food, calories, fat, the way that somebody has to burn something off, the way that potato chips are evil, or like the way that like
Mm-hmm.
someone's being good today by avoiding eating a cookie.
Mm-hmm.
Um, any number of things. I mean, that's what makes it a culture. The unavoidability of it is what
Mm-hmm.
makes it a culture. The fact that you can't opt out even if you want to, that like there's not a world in which we can do it. Especially if you're working in the 9 to 5 office world and you're a woman, right? Likely you're working with all other women and or mostly other women, and right there's definitely a cost to you not being on the fitness challenge. Like you are definitely the odd girl out, and everybody knows it. And so, I mean, that's something I constantly encounter. Like when I'm working, one of the things that surprised me the most when I started working with women one on one was they were reporting again and again and again that it was the workplace where they were
Mm-hmm.
having the most difficulty. And because there was just this expectation, that they were supposed to play along no matter what weird fat phobic dieting focus thing was going on. And I
Mm-hmm.
want to like end my answer to this by going back just for a second
Sure.
to the previous question and really really encouraging people to sort of recognize, right, that like when we're doing this work, whether you're a thin person or not, when we're doing the work of interrogating, upending, and trying to rid ourselves of this horrible fat phobic education, like remember that, there's a part of the, like, remember that you're doing it, for you, right? Like you're not doing it for another person at the end of the day, right? Like, yes, there's an important component of humanitarianism where we want to see the humanity of everyone, right? That's important work. But like, if you're someone who has a lot of thin privilege or any number of privileges, remember that like when you're eradicating these ideologies, you're not doing it for another person. You're doing it for you, and to really have a stake in that work. Because like what like if, like I don't even know if we can really imagine what it would be like, the peace, the freedom, the
Mm-hmm.
joy that we would have, that we have access to when we don't hierarchize human beings.
Yeah, I would love to get a taste of that. I mean, just for one day, right? Like
Yeah,
just
yes.
turn it all off for one day. Let's see what happens and then we could decide what is better. But that's also a really interesting point because I know listeners will have this question. I know clients have this question. It's like kind of like what do they do about their fat phobia when they notice it? It's like are they supposed to try to chase it away? Are they supposed to try to sit with it and accept it? It's, that I often get this like, when I could market, health at every size as much as I want and weight inclusive. All of a sudden somebody's like, oh, well, I do have a weight concern. I got to do something about this or that in like a counseling setting. And they'll say things like, well, this just isn't my body, or I want to have less pain or something. So I'm trying to come up with something, what your response might be with respect to they've listened, they've read your book, they have a deeper awareness now about, internalized fat phobia. What next?
Yeah, I think for me, like my answer to that is to sit with it, because fat phobia, internalized fat phobia is a wound. Like
Mhm.
what you're talking, I mean, to really see it that way, that it lives in,
Mhm.
like, no matter who you are, what your body looks like, fat phobia is a wound that you have been that has been inflicted upon you without your consent, right? Like, I mean, so to really see it that way, not to look at it as something that's like, oh, it's an idea that's living outside of me. And it's like, and it's making me say weird things and think weird things, right? Like, think of it really as a hurt that lives inside of you and that you need to treat as a hurt. And I kind of think it's important to, when we look at any, any stigma or discrimination or oppression, to really recognize it, yes, as like a political entity and ideology that lives in mass media, etc. But to really, when it comes to the individual human and our spiritual internal selves, this is a pain. This hurts, right? Even if it manifests in cruelty or, weirdness or strange, concerns or whatever, that it's a hurt that lives inside of you. And that's why it's coming out, and that you need to kind of look in, recognize it as such, and treat it as such. And I think it involves a lot of like sitting, thinking, feeling, mourning, writing, right? This is my own process that I'm sharing,
That's lovely. I love writing. I mean, writing sets you free in a lot of ways. It opens you up to your truth that you actually either didn't know was there or you actually didn't want to bring into the room, And like for me, It's something after 15 minutes. I could be like, la da 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 da, enjoying the sunshine, something. I'm the worst mother ever. There's a certain time to it. So I definitely, I feel like writing about things just can open us up to our pain and help us. Once it's there, then we can, like you said, sit with it and start to think about what is going to be helpful for me. What should I do that's part of my caregiving? And I think that's a whole other part of the tolerance, is that it's like we wish we could snap our fingers and change things so just life was easier, but it's not. And so while we deal with it not being easier, how do we do caregiving in the toxic diet culture and resist it and still kind of feel like we're going to be okay, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, totally.
Well, as we wrap up here, I really would like two quick questions. One is about your advice for helping professionals. And I'm thinking in particular, like, so, dietitians, exercise physiologists, doctors, yoga instructors, they're in the helping field, and therapists, right? Truly are trying to help. And dietitians, particularly, weight normative paradigm trained. And I'm thinking of someone who, like, I'm kind of over the people who are just going to fight tooth and nail because they've been indoctrinated and aren't even open. I'm thinking more of like the open-minded, might not quite fully get health at every size, or that they literally practice in weight loss type settings, but they are listening and they're open, but they're not where they need to be, but they are a helping professional. So what should they do to reduce weight stigma and oppression of people at higher weights?
I think I want to offer, kind of echo what I was saying before, is like really beginning to see the training that maybe they've received as emerging from a very complex historical reality, and giving yourself the space to, I feel like one of the most sacred things that I tell everyone, regardless of what they're doing in this sort of environment, like around diet culture, is to give yourself the space to take a step back and look critically at your life, at your field, at your work practice, and just sort of ask yourself, right? Like, what are my values, right? Are my values that I try to meet people where they're at and create like a joyful life in the body that they're in? Or are my values to make sure that every single person hits these certain like medical criteria for health? And I think what's hard is like, I often encourage helping professionals to do research, like really read the work by people who are in the health at every size field, people who are, writing critically about the bodies of data that are like the prevalent, paradigm in medical settings. I also want to say, right, one of the things that always confounds me is there, as we know that there's this huge body of data that says that like fatness does all these terrible things. And I'm like, okay, let's just pretend. I mean, I'm not even going to argue against that body of data. There's problems with that body of data, but let's not even argue with that. Let's look at the lived reality of people who are trying to become thin by any means necessary because they've been told that they'll have a better, healthier life if they do that. Let's look at their lived reality. And I think, that body of data is much more important to me, right? Because the lived reality of people who are trying to do that is abysmal. It is like, I mean, we know dieting creates depression, anxiety, isolation. We know that it, certainly like, and we know that anxiety, depression, et cetera, those things lead to suppressed immune system. Those things lead to making poor sexual health decisions, right? Like we know that fat women advocate for condom usage less than thin women because essentially fat women have been taught that our bodies don't need to be taken care of and don't need to be defended in the same way. So, I mean, for me, right, like, I'm like, sure, that body of data, if you want to like hold on to it, go for it, right? But like, do not discard the other body of data, which suggests a lot of things about like the pursuit of a thin body creates a lot of really, really, really unhealthful and negative outcomes. And so to really, take the time to interrogate, like, what are your commitments? What are your values? Are you willing to sort of have the courage to question your field because it needs to happen? And, I don't know. I think I think I'm going to leave my advice at that.
Yes. I love courage. That was a great capstone. It really made me think of, because I hear, when I hear people, it's like, oh, but they ask for weight loss or whatnot. Like, don't look for a reason to confirm your bias. Why wouldn't they ask for weight loss? Look at our culture. So ask better questions, and I think that's what you were getting at. And yes, absolutely listen to the people who are out there who are just further along on the journey than you are, who also have your credentials and they want to help, but you've got to be open-minded and do your own work. Read a book, do your own thinking. Final question, last chapter in the book. I want freedom. So I want to close with you telling me, what is it that you want for yourself and for the world?
Whoa. I mean,
yeah, nothing major.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that chapter is really about like, right, the idea for me, freedom, the idea of freedom is always morphing. It's always growing because the more I free myself of the cultural expectation of conformity, the more robust, the more detailed that idea, that notion of freedom becomes. I think in some ways, freedom is certainly, other scholars have written about utopia, right? And utopia is always like, there's this book by Jose Esteban Munoz, and he writes about called Cruising Utopia. And he writes about how utopia is always on the horizon. We're always striving, right? As the human spirit, like has opportunities to grow, which in our culture, it doesn't, right? We have to find those opportunities. We have to make those opportunities. Like, but as those opportunities, as we say yes to them, like our notion of what a thing can be grows and grows and grows. There's something kind of like slightly frustrating about it, but there's also something magical about it. So, but I think in terms of like my lived reality now, right? Like, for me, freedom looks like every single human has the right to live a life free from bigotry and discrimination, regardless of their size or their health status. For me, it looks like being able to wear what you want without fear of repercussion. For me, it means having access to love, romantic, platonic, all kinds of love, respect, without conditions. And for me, it looks like eating what I want without any shame or fear. And so those are things that I have been able to create in my own life. And right now, I'm living kind of in this like freedom bubble in the midst of this increasingly like militarizing state like that we're living in now, right? Like and so right, I'm creating this kind of bubble where like I make room for myself and I make room for my friends. But I think at the end of the day, right, it's always striving to, create that for everyone and having that dream and having that wish. And that for me is like the sacred thing, like right inside of us, that is our wish, right? That for me, my wish is that everyone would get to have access to the things that matter to them on their terms.
And that is not impossible, as big as a hope of it and wish it is. And I hope you get your wish one day.
Thank you.
Have to throw a penny in a fountain somewhere or whatnot, or just keep on working, right?
Yes.
This has been such a wonderful conversation, and you've been so generous with your time. And so You Have the Right to Remain Fat is out now, available everywhere. Folks can read all your other wonderful work and writing as well. Where can they get in touch with you to kind of make sure they don't miss anything that you have?
Yeah, so you can go to my website, virgietovar.com, VirgieTovar.com, or follow me on Instagram at Virgie Tovar. And then every Thursday, I have a column. Every Thursday, a new article comes out on ravishly.com, RAVISHLY.com.
Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
My pleasure.
And that's a wrap on today's show. Let's continue the conversation on Facebook. Just search Body Kindness Podcast and click to join. And if you can contribute to the production costs for the 2018 podcast season, visit gofundme.com/bodykindness. We love ratings and reviews. Please do that. And don't forget to let your friends know that Body Kindness is one of your can't miss podcasts. If you have questions, comments, or guest recommendations, shoot me an email, Rebecca@bodykindnessbook.com.